So a histogram is basically a bar chart, special type of bar chart. And it's a bar chart based on a frequency table. And more specifically, a grouped frequency table. Frequency just means count. So kind of like earlier, it gave us a count of eye color. That's the frequency of the eye color. So there were 32 blues. What's the frequency of blue eyes? It's 32. So frequency just means to count. So what we do is we decide on groupings for the data, and then we count how many numbers are in each group. Some spreadsheets these days automatically will make a histogram for you like Google did. Excel added that feature a couple years ago. But often we make frequency tables too. So I'm just going to go over making a frequency table, and then we'll make that into a histogram. And then we'll have Google do it automatically. And let's use the height example. So to do that, to make a frequency table, things you need to know are what's the minimum value in the table? What's the maximum value of the table of numbers? So these two are definitely need to know. And then 3, you want either a group width or you want to know the number of groups to make. And once we get some min and max, I'll show you what I mean by each of those. So let's take a look at the height data. And I think for that, what I would recommend for the height is we're just going to highlight the whole column, Control C to copy it, and then make a new tab at the bottom with the plus in the bottom left, add a sheet. And let's just get a single sheet with all the height in there so we can play around with it. So again, I just selected the whole column, copied it. I used Control C, but you could right click and copy or edit copy, and then make a new tab to put the height in. Usually when I make a new tab, I label it. So I'm gonna just call this height. Double clicking on that sheet at the bottom. Easiest thing to do here is just to sort it. So the column is still highlighted. If it wasn't highlighted, then just highlight it by clicking on, say, the title, or using that trick from the top, Control Shift down arrow. And then what I want to do is in the data menu, I want to sort. And there's several ways to sort it. I'm going to choose sort range because I want to leave the title at the top. So I'm going to select sort range, say I have a header, which is the height, and then A to Z would be smallest to largest, Z to A would be largest to smallest. So again, to do that, I highlighted the whole column, and then data, sort range, data has a header row, and then sort height A to Z. So somebody entered a 5, so that is probably some kind of error, so we have to decide what to do with the 5. Do we delete it? Do we guess what they meant? And then I have a blank, no big deal. Oh, what the heck? I had some weird things happen. Mine did not sort properly. Did I not highlight all the, I must not have highlighted all the data. Okay, let's try that again. Data, sort, header row, sort. Okay, I have several 5s, 5.8. Okay, and then it should just, all the blanks should end up at the bottom. All right, that's a little better. I had someone that's 78 inches tall. It's pretty tall. Wait, is that? Oh, I did have somebody that was 78 inches. Yeah, that's crazy. Okay, so what do you think we should do with the 5s? I guess we should delete them because I don't know what they meant. 5.8 might have been 58. I think I'm going to delete that one too. So again, when people self-report information, sometimes we get some weird stuff. So I'm just going to delete those And then I could shift the data up a couple of ways. I'm just going to leave those highlighted and then go to Edit, delete cells, shift up. Just clean up that space. All right, so I have 52 as the smallest and 78 as the largest. I'm just going to make a note of that. My min was 52, my max was 78. If I subtract those two numbers, that gives me the range of the data. So 78 minus 52, let's see, 8 minus 2 is 6, 7 minus 5 is 2. So there's a span of 26 inches between the shortest, the smallest number, and the largest number. So then for the span of 26, I have to decide how many groups do I want in between 52 and 78, or how wide do I want each group to be? So some people might just do something like pick a nice group width. So I would say a nice width here would be maybe 5 or 10. Now, if I choose 10, then I would have the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I would only have 3 groups of data. Usually when we're making a frequency table, we want somewhere between 5 to 20 groups. Below 5 is kind of too small, and above 20 is too many groups. So I think 10 is too wide because I won't get enough. Otherwise, I could say how many groups I want, and maybe somebody might say, well, I want 7 groups. Okay? So let's just suppose alternatively, instead of choosing the group width, I might want to do something like say I want to have 7 groups. And 7 goes into 26. Oops, I did not write that correctly. 26 divided by 7, that's almost what, 4? 7 times 4 is 28. So that's a little less than 4. So 7 groups would be, yeah, that'd be okay, but that would be the width. So either you have the number of groups and you calculate the width, or you start with the width and that gives you the number of groups, right? So if I have 5 groups, 26 divided by 5 is around 5. And so that would be the number of groups. So you have a couple of different ways to go about it. So I think I'm going to go with a width of 5. I kind of like that. And I'll start at 50 and then work my way up to 80. So then to set up my frequency table, oops, my slides got out of order. Oh, no, I was just going the wrong way. What we do is we make a note of what our groups are, and then we count our frequencies. So my first group, I'm going to go from 50 to, let's say, 54. And if they're in whole numbers, then I could go from 55 up to 59. But a couple people threw point something in there. So I might have to say 54.9, 59.9, 60 to 64.9, 65 to 69. And when we do the group width, we're really looking at this first number here to that first number there, right? Starting at 50, this one starts at 55, so that's my width of 5. And then I keep jumping that way. So these guys jump by 5, those guys jump at 5. And then depending on whether I have fractions or decimals or whole numbers, I have to decide if I'm going to put a decimal over here. And because a couple people put decimals in there, I'm going to put a decimal here to match theirs. So let's see, 50 to, okay, 55, 60, 65, 70. And then to get that last one, I'm going to have to go 75. And then I look at the data and I just count how many are in each of these groups, looking at the data set. And they're already in order, so that shouldn't be too bad. So there's 1 in that first section. And then up to 60, there's 2. So the frequency of numbers in that group is 1, right? Frequency just means count. There were 2 just before 60. And then from 60 to just before 65, there's a whole bunch. And one cool thing about a spreadsheet is if you highlight a group of numbers, so I highlighted up to the edge of 65 from 60, in the bottom right corner it says sum, which means add them up, but I could also say, hey, just tell me the count. So it says I highlighted 33 numbers. So rather than count them by hand, the computer can help me count them. I'll show you a slightly easier way in a sec. So I've got 33 here, and then 65 up to the edge of 70. Highlight. $47. And then 70 up to the edge of 75. $24. And then there's 4 in the last category. And usually once you get your frequencies, you want to total them up to make sure it's the right number. So I want to get a total on that just to make sure. So let's see, what do we have? 7 and 3 is 10. 4 and 4 is 8, and 2 is another 10. So there's 21. And then 2 and 3 is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Did I get that right? 111. 6, 7, 9, 10, 11. I think so. So I have a header, I'm at the 112th row. And remember, this doesn't match the count of people that filled out my form because some people didn't answer on the height and some people entered numbers I couldn't use. I do have the right sum there. And then, so that's a frequency table. All we have to do is on the frequency table, we decide how to group the numbers, we lay out our groups, then we just count what's in there. Now, it turns out the spreadsheet has a way to do this automatically for us in a couple of different ways, but I just wanted to give you the idea of how this comes about happening. And then once I have those frequencies, then I can make a chart based on that. So then for my chart, I would just lay out my axes and then set up my groups. So if I started over here at, 50, let's say that's 50, this would be 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80. And then I would need to scale this so I can show up to 47. So if we went 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And so we just make a bar chart for these groups. So the first one is pretty low. Next one is just a hair higher. And probably should use the straight line tool, but we're going to do this on the computer in a sec. And then what's next? 33. Be about here. 47 out there. 4 up here, and 4 out there. Oops. This would be what's called a frequency histogram. And so these would be heights of college students. As far as what the axes mean down here, these are my heights in inches. So whenever we make a chart, we want to make sure we label it with a title at the top and a title for each axis. And these right here is just the number of students that fit in each group. So I would just title this axis number of students. Often an axis like this would be titled frequency, but if I showed this to my mom, she'd be like, what do you mean frequency, right? So you want to give a more descriptive title. So even this title I put at the top, frequency histogram, that is just for educational purposes. I really wouldn't put that in a published chart. I would just call it heights of college students, height in inches at the bottom, and then the count of the number of students for the vertical axis. So questions on setting that up? We'll do this again later, and we're going to do a couple of these on the spreadsheet. And so the main thing about the histogram is deciding how to group the data. And so the computer makes that a little bit easier. So I'm going to show 2 ways to do this on the computer next. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a frequency table here. And to make a frequency table in a spreadsheet, it's similar but different to making it by hand. So I'm just going to make a little title here that I'm making a frequency table. And what the computer needs to know to count stuff is it just wants to know what's the largest acceptable number for each group. So for the computer to make the same counts I have here, I would need to tell it 54.9 is the largest number for this first group, 59.9 is the largest number in the second group, and so on. So the computer, to make these counts for me, if I want to see this table of numbers here, needs to know the largest acceptable value for each group. And often, for ease of typing, I would decide to make that 55 and 60, but I'm going to stick with the numbers I have here just to see if I get the same counts. So in my frequency table, we can call this group max. The first group max was 54.9. The next one was 59.9. And once I establish the first two, I can use the autofill feature. So I highlight those two numbers, let go, point to the bottom right corner and drag down till I get as far as I need to. And 79.9 is as far as I need to go. To get the frequencies, first I'm just going to give it a title. Remember, frequency means count, so I'm just going to call it count. So this works different in Excel than in Google Sheets. I'm going to show the Google Sheets version first on how to do this, and then if you want, I can show the Excel version. So the Google Sheets version is you just go to the first cell next to the first max, and then you type equals frequency. And once you type FRE, it will say, hey, the only thing I know with FRE is frequency. So we select it. Then it says, okay, where's your data? So my data is that first 52, that first height on down. So I'm just going to highlight all that data. And you could use that Control Shift down arrow trick I showed earlier, or you could just highlight them. All right. Once you get the data, it wants a comma, and then it wants to know the classes. And the classes are the groups. So sometimes they're called bins, sometimes they're called classes, groups, buckets. So now I highlight those numbers on the side there. So data first, groups second, close the parentheses, hit enter, and it will make those counts. So it found one of the heights was less than 54.9. Now I was starting with 50. The computer doesn't care. It just says anything below 54.9. And then it added this extra number at the end. It's double checking to see if there was anything after 79.9 in case I made a mistake in my groups. And it says, hey, there's nothing after that. So those should be the same numbers I got before because I chose the same endpoints. Now the problem with this frequency table is these numbers here aren't going to be meaningful to most people. Like my mom would look at this and what do you mean 55, 59.9, okay? So once I get those counts, what I usually do is insert a column in between. So from my count column, I'm going to insert a column to the left, and here's where I put the actual height ranges. So then I would put in height here, and I would type 50-54.9, 55-59.9. So the computer needs only these numbers here to get those counts. If you try to edit these numbers here, it'll mess up the counts. So you can't go over here and type 50-59.9 because then it'll mess up the counts. So you have to first put the group maxes in, get the frequencies, and then in between, put the human readable version. So 60 to 69, no, that would be, yeah, 60, go to 64.9. I can't type. Next one is 65 to 69.9 and so on. Otherwise, those numbers on their own just don't make a lot of sense. 70 to 74.9, 75, 79.9. And then I can turn those, I don't need the 0, into a bar chart. And it has each one labeled underneath. And then all I need to do is choose a better title. College students. Down below here, I should be clear its height in inches. And then count isn't a very good title. What are you counting? And so here I would be more specific and say this would be like number of students. Always kind of weird typing sideways like that. So we want to be kind of explicit. So calling this count or calling this frequency isn't all that informative for most people. So the only reason I would make a frequency histogram this way I did right here mainly is for educational purposes to try and help you understand where histograms come from. There are times when I do need these numbers here because maybe I want to turn those into percentages. So sometimes we'll do what's called a relative frequency table. I'll define this in my notes in a sec. So relative frequency is just a percentage. Frequency is just a count, right? So these counts are really also called frequencies. So relative frequency just means divide by the total. So I need to know how many numbers there are. So let's move this out of the way and put a total down here. To total, we use the sum command. So equals sum for sum. And then I highlight the numbers I'm adding up. So it says there's 111. So to get the relative frequency, I would just type equals in the first cell, click on the first frequency, and divide by 111, the sum. Now Google's asking me nicely, do you want to fill down? Oh, sure, why not? I don't really need those bottom two numbers, except it's confirming 100% down here. So I think maybe I'll highlight those, make them percents. And I don't need the bottom two. Okay. so to make the relative frequency, I'll just repeat that. We need to know the total, and to get the total, underneath the frequency column, I just sum them up, make sure they add up right, kind of like I did earlier to double check. So what's the sum of the numbers above? To get the relative frequency, we just take the frequency divided by the sum. So equals frequency divide by sum. And it's easier just to type it than to click on the number down there. And then I can autofill that and make it a percent. So sometimes instead of graphing the number of students, we might graph the percent of students instead. And again, that's what's called a relative frequency histogram instead of just a regular histogram, which just counts stuff up, which is kind of nice. So sometimes I need the frequencies in order to get the relative frequencies. And it just takes a little practice making these. Questions on the frequency or relative frequency at the moment? All right, so we'll do this one more way, and then we'll call it quits for today. So again, here, the point was a histogram comes from grouping and then counting how many things are in each group. Sometimes we like to see a table of values for that along with the graph, but sometimes we just want the graph. So if you just want the graph and you don't care about the frequency table, Google and Excel offer a pretty easy solution. You just highlight the raw data. It doesn't even have to be sorted. So I'm just going to highlight my data set. It wouldn't matter if it's sorted at all. Once it's highlighted, you just say, hey, make me a chart. Sometimes Google will guess, would you like a histogram? And this time it guessed right. I did want a histogram. Now notice that looks a little bit different than the histogram I graphed. Google built it a little bit different. It's going from 50 to 53, 53 to 56, 56 to 59. So where I had a bin or bucket width of 5, Google picked a bin or bucket width of 3. So it has a fancy algorithm for choosing the width of each group. They were calling them classes in the frequency table, but if you go to the customize section of the histogram, here they call them buckets. So Google automatically picked a bucket size of 3. If we wanted a bucket size of 5, it would look more like the one we created here, but Google makes them tight up to each other, whereas my bar chart from before had a little gap in between them. So it's just kind of an aesthetic thing. What do you like better? I like this one better just because it was easier to make. I didn't have to make the frequency table, which was quite a bit of work. It was a lot of work by hand. It was a little bit less work using the frequency function, but using the histogram builder, it's super fast. Then the last thing I just need to do is fix the titles. So histogram of height in inches isn't a very good title. All right, so I can just double click that and say, college students. And notice there's no numbers on this, there's no name on the side here. It would be a good idea to put that in. So from the custom chart titles, I just want to switch from the chart title to the vertical axis title. And I think the best name for this is number of students. Students are what I'm counting here. So height in inches at the bottom, number of students on the side, reasonable title at the top. So for the most part, I like Google's quick histogram builder. Excel has a similar builder with a lot more options. So that's available to you too if you like Excel. Just another set of options there. All right, so I think that's enough math for today. I just want to point out, and we'll talk more about this in the next class, the activity. So the first 2 activities are just about building charts, the first 3 actually. So the basic charts one here, we did a couple of these. I want you to come up with an example of a pie chart, and you could draw it by hand, or you could use a computer to do it if you have the numbers in a spreadsheet. And I'll do a couple more examples of these, but I include some here. So here's an example of a pie chart. I wrote down about how much things I do each day, right? So the main things I do each day are I deal with food, aside from sleeping, right? I didn't include that here. I do work stuff, I do some play things, I do chores, and I exercise. Sometimes there's some overlap there, like one of my things to play is to mountain bike. That's also exercise. So I had to decide what went where. And in this case, I took the time in hours, so 16 hours of my waking day, assuming I sleep 8 hours, and then I turned those into decimal fractions here, and then I used those decimal fractions to split up my circle. So if you want, you could try drawing one by hand. To make that circle right there, I just put a glass on the table and trace the glass. So if you want, draw it by hand or use the computer. A bar chart, in Excel, in Google Sheets, I just looked at my recent water bill and then typed the numbers in and had Google make me a chart of how much water I use each month. Pictograph. We didn't get to those today, but please read the book to see some examples of pictographs. So this one right here is I just took a little picture of a cat and some of my neighbors and friends and list how many cats they had. So my neighbor Linda has 6 cats. I have 3 cats. My friend Margaret has 3 cats. So a pictograph is basically like a bar chart, but instead of a bar or a dot for a dot plot, we use some image for that. And I'll give some more examples of that next class. There's some in the book too. Dot plot, we looked at an example of that. Here I chose the number of times each day I asked my daughter to clean her room in the past month. So 3 times, I asked her 3 times. That happened 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different days I had to ask her 3 times to clean her room. One day I asked 7 or more times. Dot plot. I didn't get to line graphs today, but I will next time. Line graphs are used over time. So pretty much the only time you want to connect the dots to make a graph is if you have something happening over time. So I thought this was a pretty cool one, that it used to be, there were more men with college degrees in the workforce than women. But last year, 2 years ago, women with college degrees working exceeded men by a little bit. And I'm curious to look this up again to see if it's kept women are outpacing men in terms of college degrees and working. And this one right here, I really shouldn't submit somebody else's graph. I should enter these numbers into a spreadsheet or redraw it by hand. So don't just copy someone else's graph, make your own. So I was bad here. Don't do what I did there. I'll make a better one there for next class. All right, so again, we're out of time for fun with math. Any questions? Hopefully you learned a little bit about using a spreadsheet, and we'll play more with